She made the same coffee every morning for 8 years, serving the same customers who saw her as just another small-town business owner. They had no idea that the quiet woman behind the counter had once flown F-16 Fighting Falcons through enemy airspace at Mach 2. They had no idea that her steady hands, which now steamed milk and pulled espresso shots, had once guided million-dollar aircraft through combat missions that officially never happened. And they had no idea that in exactly 37 minutes, a damaged military jet would fall from the sky above their peaceful Montana town, forcing her to choose between the anonymity she had carefully built and the life of a young pilot whose father she had saved 24 years ago. Welcome to the Human Stories. This is a story of hidden courage and extraordinary coincidences that reminds us that heroes often walk among us unrecognized. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please share this with others who appreciate tales of quiet heroism and sacrifice. The coffee shop was unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon when the sound split the sky above Main Street. Sarah Mitchell looked up from the espresso machine as a military training jet screamed overhead, too low, engines sputtering with the distinctive irregular rhythm that made her blood freeze. While her customers rushed outside to stare and point, she remained motionless behind the counter. She knew that sound. She knew what came next, and despite 8 years of hiding her past beneath layers of small-town routine, her instincts kicked in faster than conscious thought. Sarah had owned Skyline Coffee for exactly 8 years. Every morning she unlocked the same door. Every evening she counted the register and swept the floors. She appeared to be just another local business owner in Cedar Falls, Montana, a woman who had found her place in this peaceful community, tucked between rolling hills and endless sky. But none of her customers noticed the details that would have told a different story. None of them saw how her eyes automatically tracked every aircraft that passed overhead, calculating altitude and approach vectors with mathematical precision. None of them questioned why she kept emergency supplies in her truck, or why she sometimes stared at the distant mountains with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of classified secrets. What they didn't know was that Captain Sarah Elena Mitchell had once been among the elite women pilots qualified to fly F-16 Fighting Falcons in active combat zones during the Gulf War and its aftermath. What they didn't know was that she had flown missions that remained sealed behind congressional security clearances and earned commendations that officially didn't exist. What they didn't know was that her military records were classified at the highest levels, accessible only to those with special authorization. Most importantly, what they didn't know was that she had left the Air Force under circumstances that haunted her daily, circumstances connected to a classified mission in 1999 that had saved 3 American servicemen and ended her military career in a single devastating moment. At 3:17 p.m., everything changed. The sound began as a distant rumble that made Sarah's trained ear instantly alert. The pitch was wrong. The engine rhythm was irregular. The aircraft was in distress. By the time the F-16 appeared over the rooftops of downtown Cedar Falls, flying so low that windows rattled and car alarms began wailing, Sarah was already calculating emergency procedures she hadn't used in 8 years. Her customers reacted with predictable civilian excitement. Coffee cups were abandoned as people rushed to windows and doorways. Someone shouted about the impressive sight of military aircraft up close, but Sarah stood frozen behind her espresso machine, watching through the front window as the F-16 banked sharply to the left, trailing a stream of black smoke from its single engine. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly. Too rapidly for a controlled approach to any nearby airfield. The pilot was in serious trouble. Sarah's mind automatically began calculating vectors, distances, and emergency landing options, even as her conscious thoughts screamed at her to stay hidden, stay safe, stay anonymous. For 8 years, She had successfully buried Captain Mitchell beneath layers of civilian routine and small-town invisibility. But watching that damaged aircraft struggle across the Montana sky, she felt her carefully constructed identity beginning to crack under pressure. The F-16 made another pass, lower this time, and through her window Sarah could see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit. Even from a distance, she recognized the body language of someone fighting for control of a machine that was rapidly becoming uncontrollable. The sight triggered memories she had spent years suppressing: the weight of flight gear, the smell of jet fuel mixed with adrenaline, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But there was something else, something that made her hands tremble as she reached for her keys with sudden urgency. This wasn't just any training accident. Something about the aircraft's markings, something about the way the pilot was handling the emergency, triggered recognition that hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Sarah untied her coffee shop apron with movements that suddenly carried military precision. She dropped it on the counter and walked toward the door with purpose. Her truck was parked behind the shop, and in its locked toolbox was equipment she had hoped she would never need again. The dusty case contained items from her military service: a radio capable of accessing emergency frequencies that bypass civilian channels, road flares marked with codes that only military personnel would recognize, and most importantly, a laminated authentication card bearing access codes that could either save someone's life or destroy what remained of her carefully constructed civilian existence. Her fingers moved over the radio controls with muscle memory that 8 years of coffee making hadn't erased. The emergency frequency came to her instantly, automatically, like a phone number burned into permanent memory by years of combat operations. The response to her emergency call came faster than she expected, but what the voice on the radio told her made her blood freeze and confirmed her worst suspicions. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Jennifer Parker. 24 years earlier, Captain Sarah Mitchell had made a decision that saved 3 American servicemen and ended her own military career in a cascade of classified consequences. The mission had been buried so deep that most of the people who had been there couldn't legally discuss what had happened, even decades later. Lieutenant Jennifer Parker was the daughter of Captain David Parker, the pilot Sarah had saved in 1999 during Operation Ghost Wind. The coincidence was profound and impossible to ignore. Sarah had spent 8 years hiding from her past in a small Montana town where nobody asked questions about previous lives or classified histories. But now her past had literally fallen from the sky above her new life, carried by a young woman whose very existence was connected to the classified events that had driven Sarah into exile. Sarah made her decision in the time it took to draw a single breath. She grabbed her emergency kit and climbed into her pickup truck. Some obligations transcended personal safety, some debts could only be paid forward, and some secrets were less important than the life of a young pilot who was about to discover that heroes sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. She drove toward Highway 12, the straight section that cut through the valley like a concrete runway seemingly designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Her truck's engine roared as she pushed it faster than it had been driven in years, racing against time and gravity that was dragging Lieutenant Parker's aircraft toward the ground. The highway was perfect for an emergency landing, wide, straight, and currently carrying minimal traffic. Sarah positioned her truck sideways across both lanes, activated the emergency flashers, and began placing road flares with the methodical precision of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario. Cars approaching from both directions saw the flares and emergency lights, slowing to a stop as their drivers climbed out to ask questions. Sarah's response carried an authority that made people listen without argument. Traffic backed up in both directions, but the highway itself remained clear. The F-16 made its final approach as Sarah stood at the edge of her improvised landing zone, military radio in hand, watching the aircraft that carried far more than just a struggling engine. It carried the weight of decisions made decades ago, consequences that had rippled through time to create this impossible moment where past and present collided above a peaceful Montana valley. Lieutenant Parker brought the damaged aircraft down with skill that proved she had inherited more than just her father's name. The F-16's tires hit the asphalt hard, smoke billowing as rubber met concrete designed for cars and trucks, not military jets. The aircraft bounced once, settled, and rolled straight and true between Sarah's carefully placed flares before coming to rest less than 50 yards from where she stood. For a moment that stretched like eternity, everything was silent except for the sound of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Then the canopy slid open, and Lieutenant Parker climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, alive and apparently uninjured, but clearly dealing with the aftermath of a near-death experience. Sarah walked toward the aircraft with steps that carried 8 years of suppressed identity. She wasn't the coffee shop owner anymore, wasn't the quiet woman who made lattes and remembered customer orders. She moved like the pilot she had never stopped being, the one who had been waiting beneath the surface for exactly this moment to resurface. When Lieutenant Parker removed her helmet, Sarah saw features that were unmistakably familiar. The same determined jawline she remembered from her father. The same intense eyes that had looked at her with gratitude 24 years ago. The same expression of controlled determination under extreme pressure that marked the Parker family heritage. But before either woman could speak, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the afternoon air. Emergency responders, military personnel, and what seemed like half the population of Cedar Falls converged on Highway 12 in a chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. Among the arriving vehicles was one that made Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally crack. A black military sedan rolled to a stop, and from it emerged a figure she hadn't seen in 8 years but would have recognized anywhere. Brigadier General Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer and the man who had spent 8 years searching for her, walked directly toward the damaged aircraft. He looked older, grayer at the temples, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made him both her greatest mentor and most formidable challenge during her military career. He stopped exactly 5 feet away from Sarah and spoke a single word that shattered 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Ghost Rider. The crowd that had gathered around the emergency scene fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something significant beyond a simple aircraft accident. Several longtime residents stood near their cars with confusion written across their faces, finally understanding why their quiet coffee shop owner had always seemed slightly out of place in their small town. Lieutenant Parker looked between Sarah and General Webb with growing comprehension. The young pilot was intelligent enough to recognize the weight of military protocol and the significance of this reunion that clearly carried implications far beyond emergency response procedures. General Webb's next words confirmed what Sarah had been dreading since the moment she had picked up that radio. After 8 years of searching every small town in America, you surfaced to save David Parker's daughter. Fate has a remarkable sense of timing, Captain. The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a wave of understanding. David Parker was a Cedar Falls legend, a local boy who had died in military service 24 years ago and was memorialized with a bronze plaque in the town square. His daughter Jennifer had been born 2 months after his death, raised by grandparents who spoke of him with the reverence reserved for hometown heroes. But Sarah barely heard the murmurs of recognition and surprise from the crowd. Her attention was fixed entirely on Lieutenant Parker, who was staring at her with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, recognition, and finally, something that looked like grief mixed with overwhelming gratitude. The young pilot spoke with quiet intensity. "You're her. You're the pilot who saved my father." Sarah nodded once, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. "You're also the pilot who disappeared afterward, the one my grandparents spent 20 years trying to find. General Webb stepped closer, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even civilian crowds pay attention and fall silent. What happened here today was textbook emergency response executed by one of the finest pilots the Air Force has ever produced. Captain Sarah Mitchell didn't just save Lieutenant Parker's life. She completed a circle that began 24 years ago in combat airspace over Iraq. He turned to address the crowd directly, his words carrying the weight of official revelation. This woman has commendations that remain classified at the highest levels, missions that officially never happened, and a service record that exemplifies everything the United States Air Force stands for. She disappeared 8 years ago after leaving the military, and we've been searching for her ever since. Sarah felt her civilian identity dissolving like morning mist. 8 years of careful anonymity, destroyed in 37 minutes by a damaged aircraft, a young pilot's emergency, and her own inability to ignore someone in desperate need of help. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People she had served coffee to for 8 years now looked at her with expressions ranging from awe to confusion to deep, newfound respect. Someone in the crowd began applauding, and within moments the entire gathering was clapping for the woman they had never really known, honoring a hero who had been hiding in plain sight among them for nearly a decade. One of her longtime customers, an elderly woman named Helen, approached with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, honey, why didn't you ever tell us who you really were?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors, her customers, the people who had become her community over the past 8 years without ever knowing her true identity. "Because I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to make coffee and live quietly and never think about jets and missions and all the things I left behind when I walked away from that life." General Webb's response was measured but firm. "And how well did that work out for you, Captain?" Sarah found herself laughing despite the circumstances, the sound carrying 8 years of suppressed emotion and carefully buried identity. "Until about an hour ago. Perfectly." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt fundamental changes occurring within herself. The emergency response had awakened capabilities she had spent years trying to suppress. The tactical thinking, the split-second decision-making, the deep satisfaction of using complex skills to solve critical problems had all returned with devastating clarity. Lieutenant Parker, who had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding, finally spoke with quiet intensity. "Captain Mitchell, I need to tell you something. My father left me letters, sealed envelopes to be opened on important birthdays. And the one I opened when I graduated from flight school, he wrote about you. About the pilot who risked everything to save his life and the lives of 2 other airmen." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotions she had spent years suppressing. "He wrote that he hoped someday someone would find you and tell you that his daughter grew up knowing that heroes are real, that guardian angels sometimes wear flight suits, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but action taken despite overwhelming terror." The young pilot paused, studying Sarah's face with eyes that held her father's determination. "He also wrote that he hoped you wouldn't disappear forever, that the world needed people like you too much to lose them to guilt or trauma or whatever drives truly good people into hiding." For 8 years, she had told herself that her disappearance had been necessary, that her exile protected everyone from the complicated consequences of her classified past. But standing on Highway 12, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed anonymity, she began to understand that her hiding had been less about protecting others and more about protecting herself. General Webb watched her internal struggle with the patience of someone who had waited 8 years for this exact conversation. "The offer I made 8 years ago still stands, Captain. The Air Force needs instructors with your experience and combat knowledge. We need people who can train the next generation of fighter pilots. We need you to come home." Sarah looked at the damaged F-16 sitting on a Montana highway, then at Lieutenant Parker, whose life she had just saved, then at the crowd of Cedar Falls residents who were still processing the revelation that their coffee shop owner was someone else entirely. I have a business here, a life. These people have become my community. But even as Sarah spoke the words, she could hear the hollowness in them. The coffee shop had been a hiding place, not a life. The daily routines had been camouflage, not genuine purpose. For 8 years, she'd been playing a role rather than living authentically as the person she truly was. The sun was beginning to set over the Montana mountains as the last of the emergency vehicles departed, leaving behind only the damaged aircraft and the residents of Cedar Falls, who were slowly beginning to understand that they had been living alongside a legend without ever knowing it. Sarah stood alone beside Lieutenant Parker's F-16, her hand resting on the wing of an aircraft she understood better than most people understood their own cars. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like herself again. Not the coffee shop owner, not the quiet woman who served lattes and made small talk about weather. She felt like Captain Mitchell, the pilot who had earned her wings through skill and courage, who had saved lives in combat, and who had walked away from all of it because the weight of being a hero had become too heavy to carry. But watching Lieutenant Parker's aircraft being prepared for transport back to the base, seeing the young pilot who carried her father's legacy and determination, Sarah began to understand something that had eluded her for 8 years. Heroes weren't made by single moments of courage or individual acts of heroism. They were made by the accumulated weight of choices, by the decision to keep serving even when it was difficult, by the willingness to step forward when others needed help regardless of personal cost. This story reminds us that heroism often wears ordinary clothes and hides behind everyday routines. In our communities, in our neighborhoods, among the people we see every day, there may be those who have served with distinction, who have made sacrifices we'll never fully understand, who carry the weight of service in quiet dignity. We hope this story honors not just the fictional Captain Mitchell, but all the real heroes who walk among us, asking for nothing more than the chance to serve again when duty calls.